In the opening months of 2026, a rift that had long smoldered beneath the surface of Middle Eastern geopolitics suddenly widened into open confrontation. What began as a series of targeted operations against Iranian military and energy infrastructure in late February quickly multiplied into a multi-layered conflict, drawing in regional capitals and upending a fragile balance of power across the Gulf. Over the next 6 weeks, the battlefield extended beyond conventional front lines. Missiles and drones crossed borders, covert strikes penetrated sovereign airspace, and an attack on Iran's strategic energy lifeline sent shockwaves through markets and capitals alike. The first sharp thrust came at the end of February when coordinated air operations struck facilities inside Iran. The scope and precision of those strikes were different from past skirmishes. They focused not only on military sites, but on assets that sustain the country's economy and power projection. Tehran vowed a swift response. What followed was a rapid, dangerous escalation. Iran turned to asymmetric means, missiles and armed drones, to lash out at Gulf states, targeting territory and infrastructure in Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Civilian life was disrupted, ports and energy facilities were put on alert, and the sense of normal trade and travel that underpins the Gulf's economy was shaken. On March 18, the conflict reached a new inflection point. The South Pars gas field, the enormous offshore field near Escalation that Iran operates jointly with Qatar and that stands as the largest natural gas reserve in the world, was hit. Facilities at the field and the adjacent onshore processing hub suffered severe damage. Production halted. Flames and smoke that day were not just a striking image. They were a symbol of a different kind of warfare, one that treats energy infrastructure as both a military objective and an economic lever. Attacking South Pars carried consequences. Beyond the immediate blast radius, Iran, dependent on its energy exports for revenue and strategic influence, publicly suspended some exports, including shipments to neighboring Iraq. Markets reacted swiftly. Brent crude climbed on fears of supply disruption, and analysts warned that damage to processing and export capabilities could ripple through global energy systems for months. The strike elevated the contest from a traditional military exchange into a form of economic warfare, where the ability to generate revenue and maintain industrial capacity becomes a target in its own right. Iran's response was forceful. Across late March and into April, Tehran launched missile and drone attacks that struck at both military and civilian infrastructure across the Gulf. Power plants, refineries, and oil installations were targeted in attempts to degrade the logistical and economic networks that sustain its adversaries. The message was blunt. Attacks on Iran's economy would be met with damage to the region's energy backbone. For Gulf states, many of which rely on uninterrupted energy exports, this was a chilling demonstration of vulnerability. As the violence escalated, regional actors who had long tried to avoid direct confrontation with Iran began to act more boldly. In late March, Saudi Arabia carried out covert strikes inside Iranian territory, the first direct operations of that kind in decades. Officials and intelligence assessments described the moves as both retaliatory and deterrent, a calculated message that attacks on Saudi soil would be answered. Sources describe the operations as tit-for-tat strikes in retaliation for when Saudi Arabia was hit. Riyadh did not publicly acknowledge the strikes at the time, but their reported targets facilities linked to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and energy infrastructure made clear the intention to impose costs while trying to avoid a full-scale war. The United Arab Emirates likewise adopted a more assertive posture. In early April, Emirati forces carried out a strike on a refinery on Laven Island. Like the Saudi actions, the UAE's operations were not immediately acknowledged. They were revealed later by multiple accounts taken together. These moves signaled a notable shift in Gulf security dynamics. Nations that had long prioritized defensive postures and regional stability were now willing to undertake offensive measures to protect sovereignty and critical infrastructure. That willingness carried risks. The more actors that operate covertly in shared airspace and maritime zones, the greater the chance of miscalculation and unintended escalation. Even as military activity intensified, diplomatic channels remained active behind the scenes. Quiet conversations between Tehran and Riyadh helped blunt the intensity of direct Iranian strikes on Saudi territory by early April. Leaders and envoys stressed de-escalation and the avoidance of wider war. What emerged was a fragile conditional pause. News sustained not by formal treaties, but by continuous diplomacy, mutual deterrence, and the understanding that further escalation could produce catastrophic humanitarian and economic fallout. The economic effects of the conflict were immediate and far-reaching. Stock markets across the Gulf fell as investors recalibrated risk. Saudi Arabia's benchmark index slipped more than 1% within a single week, a visible sign of shaken confidence. Energy markets reacted even more dramatically. Brent crude surged on the perception of heightened risk to flows through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow maritime choke point through which a significant share of the world's oil passes. Analysts warned that continued interruptions to Gulf energy output could push markets and supply chains into instability that would last well beyond the current flare-up. But the consequences were not only numeric. The attack on South Pars was a stark reminder of how intimately tied modern geopolitics is to energy. Security. South Pars supplies not just revenue to Tehran, but also gas to neighboring countries. Damage to its platforms, pipelines, and processing centers reverberates through domestic power grids and industrial production, and it deepens regional anxieties about long-term investment and development plans. When energy infrastructure is weaponized, the strategic calculus changes. Military planners must now weigh economic targets alongside traditional objectives, and business leaders must consider national security as a principal risk to projects and capital. Leadership choices, both public and clandestine, shape the conflict's course at every turn. In Washington, the president emphasized caution, warning that strikes against energy infrastructure carried the risk of broadening the war. In Jerusalem, the government overseeing operations that struck deep into Iranian territory framed those choices as necessary to disrupt threats and to remove Tehran's capacity to project force. In Riyadh, the kingdom's leadership balanced covert military retaliation with diplomatic outreach, signaling an attempt to deter further Iranian action without inviting all-out confrontation. Abu Dhabi, too, coordinated with allies while asserting an independent willingness to defend its territory and economic lifelines. The escalation also reshaped regional alliances and perceptions. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, long cautious about direct confrontation with Iran, displayed a new willingness to take offensive steps. That shift raises difficult questions about the durability of the post-2010 order in the Gulf. Do these moves represent a permanent realignment toward a more aggressive security posture, or are they temporary measures prompted by immediate threats? The covert nature of many operations complicates alliance management. When action is taken without public acknowledgement, partners and rivals alike must rely on intelligence, inference, and signaling to interpret intentions and approach that. It can breed misreading as easily as it can deter. Beyond the immediate strategic and economic consequences, the war exposed a grim reality about modern conflict. Civilians and civilian infrastructure increasingly become collateral victims of broader strategic aims. Missile and drone strikes struck at energy installations that serve everyday lives, electricity plants, pipelines, and refineries. When power is cut and fuel supplies interrupted, ordinary people feel the impact in real time. Utilities falter, hospitals strain, and businesses confront sudden interruptions. The humanitarian dimensions of such disruptions are not theoretical. They shape public perceptions, political calculations, and the urgency of mediation. International actors played a dual role. They helped constrain and, paradoxically, fueled the confrontation. Global powers and regional partners engaged in urgent diplomacy to prevent the conflict from spiraling, while their intelligence and military relationships relationships with low costs. All allies shaped operational choices on the ground. The implicit and explicit messages from capitals far from the Gulf influenced calculations in Tehran, Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Jerusalem. For all the debate about who struck what and why, a common thread was clear in a region where energy, geography, and ideology intersect. External engagement matters, often in opaque ways that are hard to trace but impossible to ignore. The ceasefire that fell into place by early April was fragile by design. It rested on active diplomacy, mutual recognition of runaway costs, and a degree of war weariness on all sides. But ceasefires driven by narrow short-term calculations rarely address the deeper grievances and structural drivers of conflict. Unless political channels evolve to handle the underlying security dilemmas, the competition for regional influence, the role of non-state proxies, and the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, this pause risks being only temporary. Looking ahead, the strategy. Sea stakes are high. If the pattern of targeting economic infrastructure continues, the incentives for preemption and retaliation grow stronger. If Gulf states further normalize covert operations as a tool of statecraft, the risk of miscalculation in crowded air and maritime spaces will increase. And if markets remain jittery and investment dries up, the long-term development plans that many Gulf governments rely on could be put at peril, deepening domestic pressures and complicating foreign policy choices. There are nonetheless pathways toward stability if political leaders choose them. Stabilization will require meaningful, sustained diplomacy that addresses not only immediate security concerns, but also the economic interdependencies that make the Gulf both prosperous and fragile. Confidence-building measures, transparent channels for incident management, and agreements to protect critical civilian infrastructure could reduce the chances of accidental escalation. Regional mechanisms for de-escalation, if reinvigorated and backed by credible guarantees, could provide the breathing room necessary for more durable arrangements. The human cost of the conflict, measured not only in military terms but in economic hardship and insecurity, raises a basic question for leaders across the region. What is the strategic objective, and what price are societies willing to pay to achieve it? The choices made in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Tehran, and Jerusalem over the next months will determine whether the confrontation remains a contained episode or morphs into something far more destructive. For now, the Gulf sits in a tense equilibrium. Markets remain watchful, military assets are repositioned, and diplomats shuttle between capitals. The visible headline, a damaged gas field, a string of missile strikes, covert raids, tells only part of the story. Beneath those images lies a far more complex contest over influence, deterrence, and survival in a world where energy and security are inseparable. As the smoke clears in the weeks that follow, policymakers face a stark imperative: transform temporary restraint into lasting arrangements that protect civilians, preserve economic lifelines, and reduce the incentives for military confrontation over vital resources. That will require not only tactical restraint, but strategic imagination, new mechanisms for managing disputes, new understandings about the inviolability of civilian economic infrastructure, and a willingness by regional and global powers to invest political capital in prevention rather than reaction. History will judge these weeks not only by the damage done to platforms and pipelines, but by the choices that follow. Will leaders use this crisis to build better checks against escalation, or will they allow it to normalize a pattern where energy becomes a regular target and where covert strikes become the default instrument of policy? The answer will shape not only the security of the Gulf, but the stability of GLOBE, BAL energy markets, and the lives of millions who depend on both. In the end, the events of early 2026 reveal a simple, unsettling truth. When the engines of prosperity are also weapons of strategic leverage, the costs of conflict multiply and the lines that separate military and economic targets blur. The path out of that danger lies in politics, not force, an arduous, uncertain path, but the only one that can preserve both the peace and the prosperity